Hello. Happy to be here with you. Thank you very much for joining me. Why do I do this? Why do I ask these silly questions? Well, you see, silly questions are useful to trigger your imagination. I mean, you go to business schools and you go to work, and the people throw at you business management as if it were something which is crystallized. It's not. It might not even be relevant for the culture where you work, at least not fully relevant. So, what about this question? Why is it that the dispersion of light is so different in the northern and the southern hemisphere of the New World? It's not obvious, is it? I mean, of course there's more light in the north one, but that's largely a question of money. They can pay for the electricity bill more than the people in the south can. But that doesn't explain the dispersion, does it? Well, first place, the immigrants arrived from the ocean, so it's only natural that the dispersion would be more concentrated in the Atlantic Ocean, along the Atlantic Ocean, than in the rest of the region. But it doesn't explain why in the US the people penetrated the land more than in the southern hemisphere. That is the real question. And the answer lies in that they knew how to read and write. Yes, because they migrated to America almost 200 years after Gutenberg invented his printing press. And that coincided roughly with the Reformation, and the Protestants, by determination, they needed to learn how to read in order to read the Bible, which was not read to them by their priests. And once you start reading, you can read the Bible and many other things, including manuals on instruction. So if your pump breaks down, you just don't have to go all the way into the city or the central government to ask it to be fixed. No, you do it yourself if you can read. And this, to my view, is one of the most important reasons to explain why the Americans were able to disperse along the territory and the Latin Americans did not. Latin Americans had to remain within a shouting distance of each other. Of course, there are other reasons, but this one has been neglected for too long. So they were free to spread because they knew how to read and write. Now take the example of Brazil. I mean, the lights there are roughly aligned with the Atlantic Ocean shores. And if you think where somebody will send furniture to, and of course, it would be like this company, they will try to locate themselves where people can buy the furniture for offices or homes. And of course, if you superimpose both pictures, this is what you will get. It's only a corollary of where the people are distributed along the land. Now, of course, the Latin Americans were more gregarious culturally than the Americans from Northern Europe. Yes, it is true. I mean, just stop to think. Columbus was Genoese, and he came up to the Spaniards to tell them, listen, I'm going to try the route of the West, because the Portuguese are getting nowhere in the search for the way to the Indies. They're just wasting their time along Africa. I have a better idea. Of course, it wasn't an obvious idea, so lots of people had to be persuaded. And he got to Father Talavera, the confessor of the Queen. And the Queen, the myth goes, she offered her own jewels in order to finance the trip. But we're very gregarious. And who knew this guy, Columbus, who actually sailed along Africa with the Portuguese? Can we trust him? Put these two on his tail. Who were these two? The brothers Pinzon. I don't know if that's exactly the reason, but I wouldn't be surprised that the Spaniards put two Spanish people on Columbus's tail on his trip to the New World. Maiden trip. Now, why was it that they were brothers? You see, because in the Iberian Peninsula, the Mediterranean, Northern Africa, India, and many other countries, people stick together along family lines. So if one goes into sailing, probably a brother or cousins will also go into sailing. So the Pinzon brothers, right, they were from the same city, and they were family. And if these are crucial things to look into, because Latin Americans, Iberians, and all the others that I've told you, they're not real individualists, are they? So when it comes to work for pay, why should you pay individually when people are actually working in teams? Because much of what you have in terms of the rules of recruitment, operating now in the corporate world, stem from Max Weber and his management of bureaucracies. And he took inspiration on the Prussian army, not Latin Americans. And of course, when it comes to managing impersonally people that should be hired from the market and not along family lines, then, the paradigm spreads, and you start asking people to fix into a certain pattern and dress in the same way, and they end up looking very much alike. It's a nuisance. So much alike that sometimes you can't tell one from the other. And they start to groupthink. And that's not something which is very positive. So even if you hire them from the market, but you enforce conformity, it's quite likely that the people that make up your teams will end up suffering from groupthink, even if they are not family. So it doesn't mean that by managing the same way, you're going to get something better. Take this case, for example. The World Bank praised itself, and correctly, for having a very strict system of evaluation of its projects. But I wasn't a World Bank member at the time. I was lecturing at Princeton, and I was called up to comment on the feasibility of a certain project. Now, I was called up only because I had been in the site of that project earlier on, because I was doing some consulting work regarding shanty towns. Yes, in my heroic days, I used to work on shanty towns in Brazil, and because of that work, the World Bank hired me to work in Mozambique as a consultant for some time while I was at Princeton. Now, because I was in that area, and nobody else of the World Bank had been in that area, I was called into a meeting to comment on what I thought would be possible. Now, I was not an electricity expert. Certainly I knew nothing about the core subject of the project itself. But when it was brought up, I realized what they were talking about. I had been in that area, and I had slept in a work site of an Italian company, because there were no hotels. So when this gentleman of the World Bank, the old cows, sacred cows of the World Bank, said, "Has anybody been there?" He was actually English. And, everybody looked at me, and me, the little Alfredo, had been there for different reasons. And I said, "Yes, well, did you have a hotel to sleep in?" And I said, "No." "Where did you sleep?" "In a workers' campsite." "Oh, forget it." And they coughed it out, right? One of the reasons for neglecting the funding of that very important transmission line for Mozambique was that there weren't in the World Bank enough people able to walk into that thing and lodge themselves safely and comfortably in a 5-star hotel. Now, why? Because the people are selected in that way, and they refuse to work if they're not giving those perks. Right? Now, why was it that this Argentinian concocted a soft drink which consisted of soy milk, and it was mixed with tropical or other juices, fruit juices? And he did that because he wanted to add value to the work of his poor peasants in Tucumán in Argentina. And it worked very well, and it went off, and it was bought by a multinational and then bought by another multinational, and it reached a market of something like $1 billion a year in revenue. But at a certain moment, that invention was bought by an American multinational who was so fond of the purchase that said, "Listen, change nothing except the location of the factory." And they moved the factory to the capital city of Argentina, Buenos Aires, and defeated the original idea, which was actually to offer employment to those people which were otherwise very poor. So you see, why is it that a multinational will decide to change the location of the factory to the capital city? Well, I mean, I wasn't privy to that decision, but most probably is if you want to manage it and send some of your people down, you might as well consider that they will be going with their families and perhaps children, which will need international schools and a convenient environment, and Buenos Aires is beautiful. Tucumán may not have sounded that attractive for international corporate executives, so they moved the factory to Buenos Aires and they defeated the original purpose to add value to the production and value and money to the people that were producing the good. Why? Because those are the types of people that get hired and make up the cadre of multinationals. And so, to some extent, those people are very similar to what you found in the coastline of continental China at the time of, 19th century, 17th century including, and they were called by their Portuguese name comprador, the comprador class. Why? Because they used to buy for the Portuguese. They were agents, middlemen. They became quite rich with that. Of course, hated by revolutionaries later on. But it so happens that the multinationals today are not very different from the multinationals then. And when they move into a country and they hire executives to staff their corporations, they hire the people that, most likely they can feel comfortable with sitting at the table together. And this excludes the vast majority of the population that could actually do very good work for perhaps an even lower pay, but are not called to the meetings. They're not recruited. Brazil, where this lower picture was taken, has about half of its population declaring themselves as non-white. But it's very hard to find any executive in Brazil in a leading position, a managerial position, even if not very high up in the managerial position, very high to find a Brazilian of non-white complexity in a position of management, because this is the way that they're selected. I mean, not intentionally, of course, but nobody actually looks into it and what that is doing to those societies. Because if you exclude the vast majority of the population from high-income opportunities, well, they don't really have many other places to work in. And, these societies become quite unattractive for people who are non-white. And this is one of the reasons why Latin America has such a very high level of violence. People don't really make an earning. And you will find people who are non-white or look non-white, usually clapping in the audience, but very seldomly at the lectern, speaking to the public. And of course it gets to this terrible situation as this Brazilian picture, in which I don't know how on earth somebody thought that it would be good to have everybody dressed up in black to turn up to the picture of this organization. But this gives you an idea of the taste for the pressure for conformity, according to a level of recruitment, message, an idea that it has to be impersonal, that people have to be selected by their CVs. As if it were true, because, people are asking, recruiters are asking English, command of English at entry-level positions, when it doesn't make any sense because the English language will not be used at that level. And if somebody didn't know English enough, they could learn it by during the time it will take until they actually need to use it. But, these are the things that go. So you see, asking silly questions. Why is it that the light dispersion is different? Why is it that you don't have non-whites in management positions? Not only in the World Bank, but also at multinationals, at the subsidiaries of multinationals. Why is it that multinationals are staffed by boards that do not reflect the breadth of their activities across the world? Why is it that we still pay people for individual performance rather than for team performance when the work is done by teams, particularly in societies like the Latin Americans, Iberians, Mediterraneans in general, North Africans, Africans in general, Indians and other, the work is preferably done by teams. But you see, the mechanisms for reward are still individualistic. It doesn't make much sense. So you see, when it comes to the situation in which you feel uncomfortable with management, well, then ask the right questions, because quite likely you're going to be right, or at least you will start a revolution, which is what we need. It's not an issue of throwing away the American management as we have learnt it. No, we can't even dream of throwing the baby out with the tubwater. No, it's not that. There are lots of very useful things that have been thought out over a century or more. But the fact is that, we need to think it afresh. And that if we don't, we're still wasting our time, just dragging our feet, perhaps even sabotaging the work. So, while you're at it, just pay attention and do the right thing for the benefit of everybody. Thank you very much for listening.